of my Southern heritage, and you should be too. Sons, daughters, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. It is truly an honor to be with you today. We are in the midst of a great crisis in this country. The acceleration of the removal of symbols and monuments of Confederate history is now rampant. Students at a university voted to have a statue of Jefferson Davis removed because they said he is racist. Others want to rename sections of the Davis Highway because he is a bigot. It is unbelievable. What if the history of Jefferson Davis disappeared? However, are these people willing to change other aspects of history that involves Davis' legacy? The U.S. Army, Davis has strengthened it and increased the salary of the military. The U.S. Capitol buildings would have to lose its wings. The aqueduct in Washington, D.C. would disappear. The railroad expansion to the Pacific would not exist. Scientific advances in weaponry would have lagged. The improvements in West Point's curriculum would have languished. Jefferson Davis is our history. He is part and parcel of our collective past. I was blessed to be the archivist at the former Museum of the Confederacy for 7.5 years, and in his collections are documents to prove that he had an extraordinary relationship with people of color. However, to understand Jefferson Davis, we must examine his older brother, Joseph Davis. Joseph Davis was Jefferson Davis' mentor after the death of their father. He was an important figure and followed most of his advice from him. Joseph, a lawyer, the owner of Hurricane, a large plantation, his plantation thrived due to his treatment of slaves. The men and women of color lived in 2-room cabins with porches in the front and back. There was no rationing of food, and he dressed them well. If there was any infractions, there was a hearing held every Sunday where the slave was judged and sentenced by his or her peers. If the punishment was too harsh, Joseph would step in to lessen the sentence. The men and women of color were encouraged to study and expand their skills. He encouraged entrepreneurship. He allowed the celebrations of birthdays, weddings, and other joyous events. One of the most fascinating stories is about one of his slaves named Benjamin Montgomery. Joseph bought Benjamin, who was born in Virginia, and brought him to Hurricane. Montgomery ran away, but Joseph sent word for his return. It turned out that homesickness was the issue, but Joseph realized his intelligence and offered the use of his library to Benjamin. Montgomery's skills will lead him to become the manager of the plantation and to become an entrepreneur with Joseph's blessing. When Benjamin took a wife, she was free to run her household and raise the children due to the money he earned. He paid Joseph in cash for her not to have to work on the plantation. Jefferson Davis admired the operation of Hurricane and spent many hours learning from his brother. He will apply the same procedure at his plantation, Briarfield, named because there were so many briars. Davis had a close relationship with a slave from his youth named James Pemberton. He had traveled with Davis when he was in the military service and was with Davis during bouts of malaria. The bond was so strong that Pemberton would become the overseer for Briarfield. There was mutual respect and they even smoked cigars together. Pemberton ran the plantation until his death in 1852. Jefferson Davis felt that he should not name his slaves and that they were able to choose their own names. There were no nicknames on his plantation. Just like Joseph, he set up a court system where the slaves served on the jury. These servants had land to grow vegetables and had chickens for eggs and pigs for meat. What they didn't eat, they could sell, and they kept the funds. Dentists and doctors were called in to take care of his workers, and they were well clothed. Davis also had a white Methodist minister to come to both Hurricane and Briarfield because it was important for the servants to know Christianity. A man of color who could no longer work kept up the spirituality of the workers on the plantation. Uncle Bob was given a house as well as a horse and buggy to travel around the plantation. When Jefferson Davis became the president of the Confederate States of America, he left the running of his plantation to his slaves. He gave them all the supplies and extra blankets that he could afford. When the federal troops arrived at Bryfield, they did not believe that Davis left them to run a plantation and took their supplies. They even confiscated the blankets. Some of the men and women of color were moved off the plantation and taken into Vicksburg. When Sherman's army captured them, they refused to follow the troops. This caused great consternation, so the army burned their houses to make them leave. Others left on the plantation only to have General Grant added recently freedmen and women of color at Bryfield. The plantation was now overcrowded, and Davis' slaves, including Uncle Bob, was pushed off the land. At the White House of the Confederacy, the household consisted of immigrants, slaves, and free people of color. In 1862, Jefferson Davis was concerned that the war was getting too close to Richmond. Davis sent his wife Verena and the children to North Carolina. There, Mrs. Davis met a free Indian Negro whom she hired. When she returned to Richmond, she brought James Henry Jones to be Mr. Davis' coachman and valet. They worked well together. When the Davis family left in Richmond in 1865, Jones went with him and was captured with the entourage. He would spend a short time with Davis at Fortress Monroe. He returned to North Carolina and became a prominent citizen. Mr. Jones never forgot Jefferson Davis. When Davis' funeral cortege arrived in North Carolina, James drove the hearse. At the same time, Mrs. Davis, with great fanfare, gave a beautiful cane to him. This cane had the inscription on the silver band that said, "To my friend, James Jones, from Verena Davis." Why is this so important? It was known in Southern society at the time that a man of color was not given the status attached to owning a cane. To own a cane meant that one held a high position in society. Mrs. Davis defied rules of society by giving Jones the cane. The cane is now the property of the North Carolina Museum of History. His relationship with the Davis family did not end with Jefferson Davis' funeral. He would drive the funeral carriage with Davis' daughter Winnie in 1898 and for Verena Davis in 1906. Mr. Jones will make the trip back to Richmond, Virginia to see the laying of the cornerstone of the Jefferson Davis Monument. James Jones continued to let the newspapers know of his fondness of the president. He was a staunch defender of Jefferson Davis, especially as someone wrote that Jefferson Davis was an address when he was captured. He always corrected the story in the press. Please bear with me as I continue to give you some more stories about the relationship between the Davis family and people of color. Many of you may know the story of a little boy named Jim Limber. I was not able to locate primary documents, but according to the secondary sources, Jim, who was 5 or 6 at the time, was rescued from an abusive relative by Verena Davis. One source actually mentioned a different name than the name that we are familiar with today. According to an article in the Swanee Review by Arthur Fleming, he wrote that the boy's name was James Henry Brooks. Jefferson Davis took the boy to the mayor of Richmond's office to register him as a free Negro. Limber moved in to live with the Davis family at the White House of Confederacy and was a playmate for the children. He even belonged to the same gang as the Davis boys, known as the Hill Cats. Limber was injured, and President Davis decided to persuade a truce between the Hill Cats and the Butcher Cats. However, he was not successful. When the Davis family evacuated the White House in 1862, Jim went with them. When Verena and her family were captured, the Federal Army took Limber away from them. Mrs. Davis strongly protested, but to no avail. According to the author, he was sent to South Carolina and then to New England, where he went to school with other Sea Island black children. He would get into fights when he defended the Davises. Many years after the war, a young man claimed that he was Limber and that he was abused by the Davis family. However, Mrs. Davis fervently denied this claim. It is interesting that 2 books written about Jefferson Davis did not mention Jim Limber. Who really knows what happened to him? Robert Brown came with Jefferson Davis from Bryfield. He was very devoted to the Davis family and was known as Iron Man. He was with Mrs. Davis when she was captured. According to Fleming, on the boat that brought Verena to Savannah, a sailor taunted her and it irritated Brown. Robert Brown asked, "Am I your equal?" "Yes, certainly," was the sailor's reply. Brown said, "Then take this," and he knocked the sailor down to the ground. While Verena was detained in Savannah, Robert Brown took the children to relatives in Canada and took care of the children. He will eventually go into service for Jefferson Davis when he was released from Fortress. Another man in service spent some time with Jefferson Davis at Fortress Monroe. He wrote a letter to Verena Davis to inform her of the condition of her husband. Fortress Monroe, July 18, 1865. Dear Madam, I am living at this place with my wife Ellen. I write a few lines to inform you that he, whom you most desire to hear of, is well and in good spirits. Ellen and myself are both well. I wish if I can raise money enough to go on and pay you a visit. Ellen sends her love to you and the children and desires to know how you all are, particularly Willie and the baby. Marianne also sends her love to Maggie. This letter will be mailed here in consequence of my being here today, but you will direct your answer to Fortress Monroe. Yours very truly, Charles Barnes. P.S. Let me know to whom to direct your letters. The Davis family was very close to Ellen and Frederick McGinnis. Ellen had been the nanny, which was an amazing feat. Mr. Davis did not believe in disciplining the children, and many nannies did not survive in that position. Ellen also spent some time in Fortress Monroe. She and her husband Frederick was settled in Baltimore and continued to write letters to Verena. Earlier I mentioned that Verena Davis had presented a cane to James Henry Jones. She also sent one to Frederick McGinnis. He wrote that the cane arrived safely and he was going to let the Society of Confederate Army and Navy borrow it. How remarkable that this information has been dormant for so many years. In the former Museum of the Confederacy, there are additional letters from ex-servants and other people of color who admired and kept in touch with the Davis family. One of the most amazing documents written to Mrs. Verena Davis is the letter of condolence after the death of Jefferson Davis. Please permit me to read that letter to you. Briarfield, Mississippi, December 12, 1889. To Mrs. Jefferson Davis, Beauvoir, Mississippi. We, the old servants and tenants of our beloved master, Honorable Jefferson Davis, have cause to mingle our tears over his death, who was always so kind and thoughtful for our peace and happiness. We express our humble sympathy. Respectfully yours, old tenants and servants, Tildy Everson, Ned Gator, Hy Garland, Tom McKinney, Louisa Neck, Grant McKinney, William Green, Mary Pemberton, Gus William, Mary Archer, Eliza Martin, William Norris, Israel Ketchens, and others. According to the book, The Davis Memorial Volume, or Our Dead President Jefferson Davis in the World's Tribute to His Memory, and I quote, another of his old servants came all the way from Florida to see him when he learned of his sickness and was deeply distressed at his death, and one of the most touching incidents of the funeral was the presence and sorrow of some of his old servants. If you recall, I had mentioned Benjamin Montgomery and his relationship with Joseph Davis. Mr. Montgomery's son, Isaiah, was also an entrepreneur. In 1886, 3 years before the death of Jefferson Davis, he wrote this letter. The Colored State Fair Association's second annual meeting at Vicksburg, Mississippi, November 10th through the 13th, 1886, Isaiah T. Montgomery, President. Honorable Jefferson Davis, Beauvoir, Harrison County, Mississippi. Dear Sir, feeling assured that you would take active interest in any enterprise tending to the welfare and development of the colored people of Mississippi, we have today mailed to you a catalog of the first fair held in '85 and some notices of the second meeting, which takes place at the fairground near the city from the 10th to the 13th November next. If convenient for you to be in this locality about that time, we would be highly pleased to have you visit the fair. We would also esteem it a special mark of encouragement if yourself and distinguished lady would name a special premium, see pages 12 to 14 in catalog, and any line that may suit to you, to be put in our catalog for '86 and completed for the coming fair with best wishes for your continuous preservation. I am very respectfully your obedient servant, Isaiah Montgomery, President. Recently, I came upon an article in an old issue of Confederate Veteran magazine about an ex-slave who knew Jefferson Davis when he was a politician in Washington. He saw him at the Prentice House in Vicksburg in 1872, conversing with several men. He approached Davis and said, "Morris Davis, don't you know me?" Starting to his feet quickly, Mr. Davis advanced, extending his hand, which the man grasped as he bowed. "Why, Lewis, I am truly glad to see you," said Mr. Davis with evident emotion. "Hope you are well." "Yes, Lewis, my health is very good." Turning to the gentleman who had witnessed the scene with interest, Mr. Davis said, "Gentlemen, please excuse me. I wish to have a few minutes conversation with this man," and led the way to the writing room. The clerk turned the key in the lock to prevent interruption. After half an hour, there came out traces of tears on their faces. Mr. Davis passed at once to his room, and the old man of color, hat in hand, went out at the door. He made the comment that Mr. Davis was the same man as he was before the war. I could provide more letters from people of color who wrote to Jefferson and Farina Davis. However, in the interest of time, I will conclude my speech. It is so frustrating, or actually quite maddening, reading or hearing people call Jefferson Davis a racist or bigot. Books written about him do not spend much time on his relationship with people of color, although these letters are in archives and boxes sitting on the shelf. However, please take some time to view the documents. We owe it to President Davis to preserve his legacy. Stand fast. Thank you.